and welcome to the latest in our Manchester Classical Association public lectures. And it's quite a large audience, still people arriving, so welcome to the latecomers as well. And it's a huge honour this evening to welcome Dr. Katherine Blouin from the University of Toronto in Canada. And you'll have read her biography on the short biography on the website. But just to say, she's an associate professor of ancient history in the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies and Classics at the University of Toronto, as well as being cross-appointed in the graduate departments of History and Religion, and has membership of the Archaeology Centre and Centre for Jewish Studies. And she holds a PhD in Roman history from the Université Laval in Quebec and a postdoctoral diploma in Greek Papyrology from Paris. She's an expert on socio-economic and environmental history with a focus on ancient and particularly Roman Egypt, as well as the ethics and decolonial entailments of antiquity-related fields. She's the author of numerous publications, including her 2014 monograph, Triangular Landscapes, Environment, Society and the State in the Nile Delta under Roman Rule. And she's co-editor of a forthcoming volume with Ben Akrigg on the Nile Delta, Histories from Antiquity to the Modern Period, and the Routledge Handbook of Classics and Post-Colonial Theory. She's, as I say, the author of many such really fascinating publications, and also the blog, which many of you may be familiar with, Everyday Orientalism. And I'm going to pass over straight away without further ado to Katherine to tell us about doing classics in a climate crisis. Katherine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, April, for the invitation, and thanks, everyone, for being here today. I will share my screen. Okay. So I want to start by acknowledging that the campus of the University of Toronto, including the Department of Classics where I teach and work, is located on the land of several Indigenous peoples. And these include the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. The sacred land of Toronto has hosted humans for thousands of years. It was also the subject in 1701 of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. This event is called La Grande Paix de Montréal. It is a treaty between the French, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, and many other Indigenous nations who pledged to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and it's now home to many diverse people belonging to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis community from all over North America, which we also call Turtle Island. I want to start with a disclaimer and just saying a few words on where and how I'm coming to you today with some thoughts on this topic of doing classics in a climate crisis. So what I will share with you is the result of my own journey of learning and unlearning about the entanglements between indigeneities, ancient and modern, the climate crisis, ancient history, classics, and other Mediterranean and West Asian antiquity fields. While my environmental history work goes back almost 2 decades, which doesn't make me any younger, my journey of thinking about how we can and what it means to do Mediterranean history and classics on indigenous land during a climate crisis is more recent. So it started about 4 years ago. So it's very much a work in progress. And as you will see, I have a lot of questions. So I'm not coming here to virtue signal or offer answers to very difficult questions. Now a word on my positioning. I'm doing this work through my perspective as a French settler from Quebec City. So my ancestors migrated to Quebec City in the mid-17th century. And now I live and work, as I said, in Toronto. So I've benefited from the work and teaching of many colleagues and knowledge keepers along the way. I consider myself a colonial subject and an uninvited guest on Indigenous land. And I'm also an ancient historian whose work focuses on Egypt, that is a land that was also colonized by the British, and on which I am also a guest whenever I am there. I am more interested in what I do and how I do so than in defending or sustaining a disciplinary tag like classics or papyrology or Egyptology. I hope that my talk today can foster what I call constructive discomfort, and maybe to inspire some new ways to contribute to lessening and accounting for classics, and more generally ancient Mediterranean history's complicity with colonialism and, by extension, the current climate crisis. And lastly, I want to express my gratitude to all the teachers and knowledge keepers who I've learned and continue to learn from. So my talk today is kind of a sandwich. So I will start by sharing, and there are 4 parts, and each part focuses on a water story, what I call a water story. So I will start by telling you the story of the land the Department of Classics of the University of Toronto is on. And then I will share a few thoughts on the relationship between the present moment we are in, which we call the Anthropocene, the current climate crisis, settler colonialism, and ancient history. And there will be also another water story, this time an ancient one. Then I will share another, let's say, contemporary story, which will focus on Alexandria. And I will end with some concluding thoughts, which will also offer another ancient water story. So let's start with story number 1. The University of Toronto's Department of Classics is housed in the Lillian Macy building, which you see on the slide here. This is where I normally work. The LMB, as we call it, is a massive gray, cold, temple-like structure. In fact, many students confided in me that they are scared to enter the building, and some of them ask friends to come with them. The entrance staircase is flanked by a colonnade, and it leads to a massive wooden door that opens up onto an immaculate lobby, which is, as you can see, entirely covered in grayish white marble. The building stands at the intersection of Avenue Road and Bloor Street, so really at the center of Toronto. It was inaugurated in 1913 and bears the name of Lillian Massey Tramble, the daughter of industrialist Hart Massey, after whom the university's Hart House is named. Lillian Massey provided funds towards the construction of the building, which housed, when it was inaugurated, the Department of Domestic Science. You can still see the name above the entrance. And fun fact, this is where the 2 first female faculty of the University of Toronto worked. Across the street from the LMB stands the Royal Ontario Museum, which we call the ROM. The ROM is Canada's largest museum, and it also houses the largest collection of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman artifacts, and also bodies. There are a few mummified bodies in Canada. The building was originally partly administered by the university, and it was inaugurated just a year after the LMB, so in 1914, and the inauguration was done by the Duke of Connaught. So there's a strong British association. Now, behind the ROM is my favorite part of campus, a shaded pedestrian path called Philosopher's Walk. If you enter the path from Bloor, you'll walk through the Alexandria gates. So now you can see the gates in their original location, right at the corner of Avenue and Bloor. So you can imagine my department building on the right and the ROM on the left-hand side. They've been moved slightly to the west since then, on the other side of the museum. The gates were built in 1901 at the instigation of the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire to commemorate the visit of Prince George, Duke of Cornwall, the later King George V, and Mary, Duchess of Cornwall, the future Queen Mary. In 2010, a small amphitheater made of stone was built in the middle of the path. I spent a lot of time in the Philosopher's Walk during the pandemic, either walking around or sitting on a bench. My son also loves to go there, and he loves going there because there are lots of squirrels, a lot of them, and also a lot of birds, which we call by their French names, because to this day, bird names in English is not my forte, and we also speak together in French. So for those who know French, there are moineaux, étourneaux, pigeons, carouges à épaulettes, cardinaux, et des oies. Now, sometime during the pandemic, a panel popped up at the corner of the Classics Department building, so the LMB. The panel, as you can see on the slide, is called Tattle Creek. Now, Tattle Creek was the name of the creek that originally flowed through Philosopher's Walk. The creek, says the panel, was originally an important gathering and fishing place for indigenous peoples. And as settlers took over the area, it was diverted to make a pond on campus, then became very polluted, and eventually was completely buried in the 1880s. One Sunday last spring, as the snow was melting, the lower part of the path became covered in water. It was as if the creek was trying to come back to the surface. To me, that was a powerful reminder of the fact that this green space, like the land on which the ROM and the LMB stand, are a European white settler colonial project that relies on the burying and erasing of what and whose land we are on. The spring resurfacing of the waters along what was Tattle Creek can also be interpreted as a good omen. Just like what was frozen melts, just as what was buried comes back to view, so are the deep histories and stories of this land here in plain sight for whoever is ready to actually pay attention. Now let's move to, let's say, the meat of my sharing today. So being an ancient historian or a classicist during a climate crisis. We are now in an age called the Anthropocene. So if you are not familiar with the term, the Anthropocene is, I give you the definition here, a geological epoch that is characterized by the fact that the human species is the prime driver of geological and climatic changes in the planet and on the planet. On August 9, 2021, CBC News posted a news clip with the following title and caption: UN sounds alarm over major irreversible climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, says the world is dangerously close to runaway warming and that humans are unequivocally to blame. CBC News was not the only outlet to cover the publication of the 3,500 page long IPCC report. Media all over the world flooded us with dystopian headlines and images that framed the report's result as warning and warnings as news. But as this was happening, I wonder what exactly is new. As IPCC Working Group 1 co-chair Valérie Masson-Delmotte commented at the time, it's been known for years on end that human activity was the cause of the current climate crisis. It's been known for years on end that we have entered the age of the Anthropocene. Evidence has accumulated for a long while, and so has the will of many not to act. Climate summits took place, pledges were made, targets were agreed upon. Indigenous peoples all over the world have been speaking out and mobilizing for decades and more. Scientists have been speaking out. activists and artists have been speaking out. And yet, over and over again, governments overwhelmingly dragged on, giving in to fossil fuel lobbies, and corporate donors invested in a status quo they benefit from. We knew, but did not care or care enough. One novelty is the pace and irreversibility of the Earth's warming, which came much faster than previously anticipated. As IPCC Vice Chair Cole Barrett said, and I quote, "This report tells us that recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, unprecedented in thousands of years," end quote. The following IPCC report was released on February 28th, so it coincided with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and so I think it was kind of buried and did not make as much noise. And there's been another report since then. But the report of February 28th not only confirms Barrett's statement, but indicates that the situation is even more dire than what was thought last summer. So it's not going well. To me, this warming, together with the predictions, the refusal to listen, and the hubris, all amount to deep, old history unfolding. I deeply believe that there is a direct link between modern European appropriation and whitening of the so-called classical past, white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, and the climate crisis. There is also a direct link between historical amnesia and the success with which large-scale polluters, corporate lobbies, and governments continue not to care. And there is a direct link between current efforts to defund the humanities. I believe that's been happening in the UK, and it is still happening in North America, including Canada, and also efforts to police critical and decolonial work within the academy, and efforts to silence conversations on the climate crisis. These genealogies matter tremendously, and this is why those of us who are teachers and students have such an important role to play in disseminating and activating this knowledge within our classrooms, as well as in the political and social spheres. Now, while a growing number of scholars working on the ancient Mediterranean do think, speak, write, and teach about ancient environmental and sometimes climatic history, there's not much that particularly reflects on the connection between antiquity and the Anthropocene. I will mention two exceptions. A colleague from Chicago, Katie Kern, wrote a piece in 2017 entitled Mediterranean Archaeology and Environmental Histories in the Spotlight of the Anthropocene. And Brooke Holmes, who teaches in Princeton, gave the concluding keynote in my university in Toronto at the Classics and the Anthropocene graduate conference organized in 2019. But why is there almost nothing apart from their work? To me, the answer might partly reside in the sheer scale of both what the Anthropocene means and what its implications are for our disciplines. For both the Anthropocene and Eurocentric academia's common relationship to modernity show through a series of binaries. So these binaries are commonly used to articulate the present-day climate crisis and also structure knowledge. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the difference between the Holocene and the Anthropocene, pre-1500 history and post-1500 history, which is a very strong divider, at least in North America, human versus environment, culture versus nature, rational versus subjective, the West, the East, the North, the South, and lastly, linear time and non-linear time. The organizing and legitimizing role played by these binaries within modern worldviews and geopolitics is well attested. In fact, many public intellectuals, for instance, Dipesh Chakrabarty, Amitav Ghosh, Naomi Klein, and Bruno Latour, have justly pointed out how limiting and detrimental they are to our understanding of the Anthropocene and so of the climate crisis. Yet a problem with these discussions is that, from my point of view as an ancient historian, they are very limited. They don't go prior to the Industrial Revolution. So it is extremely shallow, chronologically speaking. And I think it is a shame, because I truly believe that ancient histories and ancient stories have a lot to contribute to our understanding of the present. I've been thinking a lot about how ancient history and the climate crisis collide. One important way in which they do is through the notion of risk, which is understood as the produce of a hazard and a vulnerability. The concept of risk is very much akin to what Amitav Ghosh calls the uncanny. Ancient environmental crises might have unfolded before the time of the Anthropocene, but they did impact and were dealt with by human societies through religious, cultural, social, and political means. Now, if one takes aside technological advances, these human responses to risk or uncanniness share several fundamental features. In a way, they form a thread that not only runs through human history, but also transcends it. In this regard, ancient stories, whether we call them myth or not, have a lot to teach us about how our species approaches the uncertainties of the world. And I want to take as an example of that a very famous passage of Livy's work about the early days of Romulus and Remus. So the two twins, one of whom would found Rome, almost died. But Livy tells us how, for the Romans, they eventually survived. But I must believe it was already written in the book of fate that this great city of ours should arise, and the first steps be taken to the founding of the mightiest empire the world has known, next to God's. The Vestal Virgin was raped and gave birth to twin boys. Mars, she declared, was their father. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she was merely hoping by the pretense to palliate her guilt. Whatever the truth of the matter, neither gods nor men could save her or her babes from the savage hands of the king. The mother was bound and flogged into prison. The boys, by the king's order, were condemned to be drowned in the river. Destiny, however, intervened. The Tiber had overflowed its banks. Because of the flooded ground, it was impossible to get to the actual river. And the men entrusted to do the deed thought that the floodwater, sluggish though it was, would serve their purpose. Accordingly, they made shift to carry out the king's orders by leaving the infants on the edge of the first floodwater they came to, at the spot where now stands the ruminal fig tree, said to have once been known as the fig tree of Romulus. In those days, the country thereabouts was all wild and uncultivated. And the story goes that when the basket in which the infants had been exposed was left high and dry by the receding water, a she-wolf, coming down from the neighboring hills to quench her thirst, heard the children crying and made her way to where they were. She offered them her teats to suck and treated them with such gentleness that Faustulus, the king's herdsman, found her licking them with her tongue. Faustulus took them to his hut and gave them to his wife Larentia to nurse, something that the origin of this fable was the fact that Larentia was the common whore and was called wolf by the shepherd. I could have quoted many other ancient narratives or stories that would have qualified as mythical or religious, in the Western sense of the word, be it the Gilgamesh epic, and I'll come back to that later, the Heliopolitan creation story, which you see a representation of here, the Odyssey, the Vedas, the Bible, etc. I picked this particular passage because it's one of my favorite ones to teach. It is one of my favorite passages to teach because it involves a very diverse array of human and non-human agents. The Fates, the Vestal Priestess, Mars, the King, the Cradle Bearers, the Tiber, the She-Wolf, Faustulus, and Larentia. The description of the landscape and its intersection with the role of sexualized female protagonists, and we have a rape priestess of Vesta, the goddess of the heart, a breastfeeding she-wolf, and a possibly promiscuous wife. All these are infused with societal meaning, but I don't have time to expand on that here. What I want to focus on for today's talk is the role of the flooding Tiber River. It is the river in flood who saves the twins. More, it is the timing of the boy's cradle's exposition on the edges of the river's high waters and its ensuing landing on dry land as the flood recedes that saves them, allowing for the she-wolf to reach and nurse the boys. In that regard, this 2nd century CE altar to Mars and Venus, found in Ostia, Rome's maritime harbor, and now at the Palazzo Massimo alle Terme, offers a powerful visual complement to Livy's narrative. Portrayed as it was the custom by them as a lounging man with bare chest, the river Tiber, at the right of the scene, looks over the twins as they are breastfeeding the she-wolf. One could thus argue that the flooding Tiber is the main character of this story. It is he who ultimately saves the life of the twins. It is, metaphorically and literally, Rome's navel. The very hydric risk Rome was wary of throughout its history was also the very actor thanks to which its founder was kept alive. While Livy's own narration does indicate that this story was already subject to different interpretation in his lifetime, I think that to label it simply as a myth is too limiting and anachronistic. So this example to me poses the question of the limitations of our current forms of historiographical writing and methodologies. Let us be real. What is valued as rationality in so-called Western scholarship is nothing but a harness period-specific type of subjectivity that goes back to the Enlightenment. Now, given that Enlightenment scholars were themselves nourished by a particular set of representations of antiquity, essentially elitist, hegemonic, male, and literary productions, we found ourselves confined to a circular reasoning that excludes many voices from the equation and thus provides a very limited set of epistemological models. As well, B. Alak argues in his book, Restating Orientalism, a critique of modern knowledge, this issue calls for a critique and an expansion of the narrow notion of the self, as it is currently shaped in most neoliberal so-called Western societies. What does it mean to recognize that beyond the pro-Augustus undertone of Livy's work, his testimony also documents ancient, indigenous, in this case Latin, forms of knowledge? How does our grasp of that story change if we step back from the rational anthropocentric tradition and acknowledge that Mars, the Tiber, and the she-wolf are active protagonists endowed with agency. More broadly, what if we understand ancient myths as indigenous stories that both produce, process, and also transmit knowledge? What if we accept more widely that, in line with Bruno Latour's reflection on agency at the time of the Anthropocene, different geohistorical paradigms have always existed, including alongside the modernist Eurocentric tradition? What if we get rid of the idea, often implied, whereby Judeo-Christian monotheism is more sophisticated or advanced than other religious systems and traditions? How would that, for instance, impact our understanding of this relief here of the goddess Isis breastfeeding Harpocrates? What would indigenized classics and antiquity-related knowledge look like? And what would those stories teach about the current climate crisis and its possible antidotes? Now let me move to my second modern water stories, which is the third water story of the talk. This past winter, I had a Zoom chat with sociologist Amro Ali. As we were talking about the impacts of the climate crisis on Alexandria, and especially the increasing instances of maritime floodings that have been taking place in the city these past years, Amro shared with me an information I did not know until then. Experts predict that by 2050, most of the city of Alexandria in Egypt will be underwater. In a blog post of his I read after our chat, Amro shares some reflections on the matter. Short of radical adaptation, I'll just take a sip of water. Okay, I don't want to butcher this quote from Amro's article, so I'll start again. Short of radical adaptation measures, it is Alexandria, the only major city in the Mediterranean, that is at the highest risk of being largely submerged by 2050. It is no wonder why popular Google searches for Alexandria in the context of climate change reveal bizarre questions such as, does Alexandria, Egypt still exist? And who destroyed Alexandria, Egypt? It is an omen the city can do without. As I searched for the scientific literature detailing this dystopian omen, I stumbled upon a page called Climate Central, which provides a coastal risk screening tool. The tool offers an interactive visual modeling of what the submersion of Alexandria will look like. So as I move the cursor to 2050, I was stunned. The flooded area that's projected looks very much like what we think, that we being other experts, not me, think the ancient Lake Mareotis, which is today the much shrunk Lake Marriott, look like. So you can see here the comparison. On the left-hand side, this is a rendering of the ancient extent of the Mareotis Lake. And to me, it's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. So there it was, the land and the waters, alive, shifting, moving, living, with, without, or despite human presences. The gradual and increasing flooding of a huge part of the city of 5.2 million inhabitants as a result of the unwillingness of our global elites to trade profit for long-term sustainability and care for our planet is a human tragedy beyond measure. To me, a specialist of the ancient environmental history of the Nile Delta, this unfolding story also echoes the submergence of part of Alexandria's royal quarters, as well as of the nearby cities of Canopus and Tonis Heraklion in the 4th century CE. While these ancient episodes were not triggered by human action per se, but rather by earthquakes, tsunamis, and rising sea levels, one element makes them comparable to today's threat: the willingness of human communities to settle on highly shifting land, because the benefits of living on these lands are seen as outweighing the risk they represent to human communities. Let me now propose a few concluding thoughts. The Anthropocene, Canada's genocide against Indigenous peoples, the pandemic, the rise of far-right violence worldwide, and now the war, and some argue the genocide in Ukraine, which is something I agree with, are all related to each other. These compounded crises are taking place on such a broad, ungraspable scale that they force us to rethink the way modern states, corporations, and consumerist societies interact with, see, and live on this planet. By the same token, they confront us to the not only limited, but in many ways detrimental nature of the ways in which knowledge is produced in the European so-called Western tradition. So with this consideration in mind, I want to end by sharing one last water story. And it is a story found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The peoples of ancient Mesopotamia were deeply aware of their precarious status within creation. This is what transpires from the flood story found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very similar to the Noah story of the Bible. Now, flood stories have been told by indigenous peoples worldwide for millennia. And in fact, there's a strikingly similar flood story also attested in the Salish people tradition on the Pacific coast of Canada. Now, the Gilgamesh version of the flood story that has come to us might have been copied from an 18th century BC epic called the Epic of Atrahasis. The text we have is a tablet, which you see on the screen, that's now at the British Museum, and it dates from the 7th century BC. It was found by an Assyrian archaeologist called Hormuz Rassam, who was working together with Layard, a British archaeologist, in Nineveh, which is in today's northern Iraq. In the story, I'm going to read part of it with you. The deified Utnapishtim recounts to Gilgamesh how the god Ea, also known as Enki, so the god of water, instructed him to build a boat ahead of a massive flood that would wipe out all life on Earth. So the boat is built, and I'm going to read part of the text about the deluge itself. At the very first light of dawn, there came up from the horizon a black cloud. Within it did Adad bellow continually. The still clam of the storm god passed across the sky. All that was bright was turned into gloom. Like a battle, the cataclysm passed over the people. One person could not see another, nor people recognize each other in the destruction. Even the gods took fright at the deluge. They withdrew. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The ones who were curled up like dogs lying out in the open. The goddess, screaming like a woman in childbirth, Belet Ili, the sweet-voiced, wailed aloud. And then there's a long passage where she's talking, so it's a first-person quote. For 6 days and 7 nights, there blew the wind and the deluge, the gale, and flattened the land. This is a lacuna here. When the 7th day arrived, the gale relented, the deluge and the battle. The sea grew calm, that had fought like a woman in labor. The tempest grew still, the deluge ended. I looked at the weather, and there was quiet, but all the people had turned to clay. The roof plane was level like a roof. I opened vent and sunlight fell on the side of my face. I fell to my knees and sat there weeping, tears streaming down my face. Another flood has come our way, and there's no way around it anymore. We just don't know how high the waters will rise and for how long. There will maybe be a life-saving boat, but how large will it be, for whom, and how will it be built? The privileged few, including those most responsible for this mess in the first place, will no doubt be the first to save themselves. What remains to be seen is how many and who, past, present, and future, will be left behind to drown. Our tragic present and its possible antidotes are shaped by complex, multi-layered levels or webs of historical dynamics, some of which, in fact, many of which, can be traced back to antiquity. Moreover, modern imperialism, colonialism, and neoliberalism suppose self-fashioning mechanisms that rely notably on a highly curated and often whitewashed and weaponized reading of ancient Greek, Roman, and early Christian hegemonies. As long as we don't come to terms with the full length, depth, and multifaceted tapestry of geohistory, our grasp of what the present means and our ability to imagine potent approaches to the unthinkable will be severely hindered. We owe it to ourselves, to the earth, and to the past, present, and future custodians of the lands we live, work, teach, and learn on to do better. Thank you.